By the time Daniel Mensah stepped out of the airport shuttle, the rain had already soaked through the shoulders of his jacket. Rivergate looked nothing like the city brochures. The skyline was hidden behind low clouds, headlights smeared across wet streets, and the wind seemed determined to push every traveler back indoors. Daniel adjusted the handle of his battered suitcase and checked his phone. No messages. No shuttle. No update from the hotel. After nearly 14 hours of travel, all he wanted was a shower and a bed. Instead, he found himself standing alone beneath the awning of a downtown hotel while strangers hurried past without a second glance. Almost. Across the street, a patrol car slowed.
Dispatch, we have eyes on the target. He's right in front of the hotel.
One officer looked at Daniel, then looked again. Something about the man standing alone in the rain had caught his attention. 10 minutes later, that glance would turn into questioning. The questioning would turn into suspicion. And before the night was over, 2 officers would discover they had spent half an hour investigating the very person their department had invited to teach them how to avoid making assumptions. Before we continue, make sure you stay until the end, because every story has a moment where everything changes. If you enjoy powerful stories filled with unexpected twists, emotional lessons, and hidden truths, subscribe and join us for more. Now, let's go back to the beginning and uncover what really happened. Daniel had learned a long time ago that appearances were unreliable. That lesson had followed him across 4 continents, dozens of cities, and more conference halls than he could remember. It was one of the reasons he still carried the same worn backpack he'd owned for nearly 7 years. The bag wasn't impressive. That was the point. People revealed a lot about themselves when they stopped being impressed. At 38, Daniel worked as a specialist in crisis communication and police community relations. Most of his year was spent traveling between cities, helping agencies improve how officers handled tense encounters, public complaints, and cultural misunderstandings. The work wasn't glamorous. Most days involved classrooms, workshops, and uncomfortable conversations. But Daniel believed those conversations mattered. The invitation to Rivergate had arrived nearly 11 months earlier. The city was hosting a public safety summit that would bring together police leaders, emergency response coordinators, and community advocates from around the country. Daniel had been asked to lead the opening session. Not because he was famous. Because he had a reputation for saying things people needed to hear, even when they didn't particularly enjoy hearing them. A gust of wind pushed rain beneath the hotel canopy. Daniel stepped farther back and checked the time. 10:17 p.m. His ride from the airport had dropped him at the wrong location after a misunderstanding with dispatch. The hotel staff had promised to send transportation, but traffic delays caused by the storm had slowed everything down. Normally, the inconvenience wouldn't have bothered him. Tonight was different. He was exhausted. His neck ached from sleeping upright on the flight. His stomach reminded him that airplane snacks barely qualified as food. And the 6-hour time difference made it feel much later than it actually was. A family rushed past him into the hotel lobby. A businessman balanced a coffee in one hand and a briefcase in the other. Nobody paid much attention to Daniel. At least that was his assumption. 100 yards away, Officer Kyle Mercer sat inside a patrol vehicle parked beneath a street lamp. The rain tapped steadily against the windshield. Mercer had been scanning the area for nearly 20 minutes. Most of the shift had been quiet. Too quiet. The kind of shift that made some officers start looking for problems simply because they expected problems to exist. His partner, Officer Ben Lawson, was scrolling through incident reports on the dashboard computer when Mercer leaned forward. "You see that guy?" Lawson looked up. "The one by the hotel?" "Yeah." Lawson glanced through the rain. A man with luggage. Standing under an awning. Waiting. Nothing unusual. Looks like he's waiting for somebody. Mercer continued watching. Maybe. But something about the scene bothered him, though he couldn't explain exactly why. Sometimes experience helped officers notice details others missed. Sometimes it convinced them they were seeing things that weren't there. The patrol car remained still for another minute. Then Mercer started the engine. Daniel never noticed. He was too busy checking his phone again. Too busy wondering how much longer the hotel shuttle would take. And completely unaware that two strangers had already begun forming opinions about him before hearing a single word he had to say. The patrol car eased toward the curb and came to a stop near the hotel entrance. Daniel barely noticed at first. Police vehicles had become a familiar sight throughout his career. In most cities, officers parked near hotels, train stations, and transportation hubs as part of routine patrols. He assumed this was no different. Then both doors opened. The officers stepped out and headed directly toward him. Daniel straightened slightly and slipped his phone back into his pocket. The older of the two officers approached first. "Evening." "Evening," Daniel replied. The officer's eyes briefly moved from the suitcase to the backpack before returning to Daniel's face. "You staying here?" Daniel glanced toward the hotel lobby. "Actually, I'm waiting for transportation to another hotel." The officer nodded slowly. "What hotel?" "The Grand Meridian." "You got a reservation there?" "I do." The officer didn't respond immediately. Rain drummed against the awning overhead. People continued moving in and out of the lobby. For a few moments, the conversation felt normal. Then the questions kept coming. "What brings you to Rivergate?" "Work." "What kind of work?" "Consulting." "What sort of consulting?" Daniel hesitated. Not because he was hiding anything. Because the conversation suddenly felt strangely one-sided. The officer hadn't introduced himself. Hadn't explained why he was asking. Yet seemed determined to know everything about a complete stranger standing in the rain. Daniel answered anyway. "I work with public safety organizations." The younger officer exchanged a glance with his partner. Something passed silently between them. Daniel noticed. Years of teaching communication skills had made him unusually sensitive to small changes in behavior. People often revealed more through expressions than words. The older officer folded his arms. "You from around here?" "No." "Here for long?" "A few days." "Traveling alone?" "Yes." The questions continued, one after another. Each answer seemed to create another reason for further questioning. Daniel checked his watch. The hotel shuttle was already late. His patience wasn't gone yet, but he could feel it thinning. Nearby, a couple standing beneath the awning briefly looked over before whispering to each other. Another guest slowed his pace while entering the hotel. The interaction was becoming noticeable. Daniel wasn't worried. He was confused. Nothing about the situation made sense. He was standing beside a suitcase, holding a conference folder, waiting for transportation. Yet somehow the officers appeared increasingly interested in him. The older officer studied him carefully. "Mind telling me why you're carrying all your luggage around this late?" Daniel blinked. A small laugh escaped before he could stop it. "Because I just came from the airport." The younger officer almost smiled. His partner didn't. Instead, he took another step forward. Daniel felt it immediately. The conversation had shifted. This was no longer curiosity. The officer seemed to be looking for something. The only problem was that Daniel had no idea what. The wind picked up again, spraying mist beneath the awning. Daniel adjusted his grip on the suitcase handle. The older officer looked him over once more. "Can I see some identification?" Daniel nodded. "Sure." He reached toward his jacket pocket. Slowly. The word wasn't shouted. But it was firm enough that several nearby people turned their heads. Daniel stopped for a second, then slowly removed his wallet. A strange feeling settled into his stomach. Not fear. Disappointment. The kind that appears when a situation starts heading somewhere it never needed to go. He handed over his passport. The officer examined it. Then looked back at Daniel. Then back at the passport. As if trying to reconcile the information in front of him with the conclusion he had already formed. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. Everything about him suggested he wasn't entirely sure where this encounter was headed either. The older officer handed the passport back. "You said you're here for work?" "That's right." "What kind of work again?" Daniel stared at him. The question had already been answered. Twice. "Consulting." The officer frowned. "What kind?" Before Daniel could answer, a voice came from behind them. "Everything okay over there?" A hotel employee had stepped outside to smoke under the awning. The officer immediately responded. "Just talking." The employee nodded and walked away. But not before looking back twice. Now Daniel knew it wasn't just him. Other people could feel the tension too. The officer turned back. "Mind emptying your pockets?" Daniel looked at him carefully. The request caught him off guard. "Is there a reason?" The officer's expression hardened. "It's a simple request." For a moment neither man spoke. Rainwater streamed down the edge of the awning between them. Daniel knew arguing would accomplish nothing. So he complied. "Phone. Keys. Boarding pass. Conference folder." Then the wallet. As he opened it, several cards slipped loose and scattered across the wet pavement. One landed near his shoe. Another slid beneath a bench. The younger officer instinctively bent down to help collect them. Daniel crouched as well. A hotel guest nearby stepped aside to avoid the rainwater flowing toward the scattered cards. The younger officer gathered the first card. Then another. Then a third. His eyes narrowed. He looked closer. Daniel immediately noticed a change. The officer wasn't confused. He was reading. Carefully. The younger officer stood up slowly. The rain continued falling around them. Cars hissed past on the street. For several seconds he simply stared at the card in his hand. "Ben?" His partner sounded irritated. No response. "Ben?" The younger officer finally looked up. His face had gone completely still. Not shocked. Not scared. Just processing. "What is it?" the older officer asked. The younger officer glanced at Daniel. Then back at the card. Then handed it over. The older officer took it without concern. At first. But as his eyes moved across the text, the confidence he'd carried since stepping out of the patrol car began to fade. Slowly. Noticeably. And for the first time that night, Daniel realized the encounter was about to change in a way either officer had expected. Officer Mercer took the card from his partner and glanced at it with the confidence of someone expecting to prove a point. That confidence lasted less than 2 seconds. His eyes moved back to the top of the card. Then down again. This time more slowly. The rain continued falling around them, but Mercer no longer seemed aware of it. "What is this?" he asked. The question wasn't directed at Daniel. It sounded more like he was asking himself. Daniel rose from his crouched position and brushed rainwater from one knee. "It's exactly what it says." Mercer's eyes returned to the card. The identification belonged to an international public safety organization. Attached to it was Daniel's professional credential listing him as a senior specialist in crisis communication, community trust, and officer-citizen interactions. Mercer looked unconvinced. Or perhaps unwilling to believe it. He immediately reached for the conference folder Daniel had placed on the bench. Inside were travel documents, speaking schedules, event credentials, and official correspondence from city administrators. The officer flipped through the paperwork. One page. Then another. Then another. Each document told the same story. Daniel wasn't in Rivergate by accident. He wasn't wandering the city without purpose. He had been invited. Months earlier. Officially. By the same city now questioning why he was standing outside a hotel. Lawson quietly exhaled. Mercer remained silent. Daniel could almost see the officer replaying the last 30 minutes in his head. Every question. Every assumption. Every conclusion. A black SUV suddenly pulled up near the entrance. The rear passenger door opened. A woman stepped out carrying a folder against the rain. She hurried beneath the awning and immediately spotted Daniel. Mr. Mensah. Relief washed across her face. Thank goodness. We've been trying to contact you. Daniel smiled politely. The weather seems to have complicated everyone's evening. The woman nodded. Then noticed the officers. The documents. The small crowd still lingering nearby. The awkward silence. Her expression shifted. I'm Karen Whitmore, she said. Deputy Director for the summit. Neither officer said a word. Karen looked from Daniel to Mercer. Then back again. What happened? Mercer opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because there wasn't a simple answer. The problem wasn't that Daniel had been questioned. The problem was why the questioning had continued long after the answers were already available. Karen glanced at the credential in Mercer's hand. Recognition appeared instantly. Oh. She understood. The silence that followed felt far more uncomfortable than any argument. Then Karen said something that made this situation even worse. Mr. Mensah is leading tomorrow morning's opening workshop. Mercer swallowed. Karen continued. The session on improving public trust during citizen encounters. Nobody spoke. Not Daniel. Not Lawson. Not the crowd. Certainly not Mercer. The irony didn't need explaining. Everyone standing there could see it. Then Karen turned toward Daniel. Her voice softened. Mr. Mensah, if you'd like to make a formal complaint, the city will support that process. For the first time all night, every eye shifted toward Daniel. Waiting. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked past the officers toward the street. Water flowed along the curb in narrow streams. Traffic moved slowly through the storm. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed through the city. For a moment, nobody seemed willing to interrupt his thoughts. The truth was, Daniel was tired. Far more tired than anyone realized. Not just from travel. From moments like this. Moments he had experienced in different forms throughout his life. Different cities. Different countries. Different people. The details changed. The feeling rarely did. He looked back at Mercer. The officer seemed completely different now than he had 30 minutes earlier. Not because Daniel's identity had changed. Because the officer's perception had. That realization bothered Daniel more than the questioning itself. Finally, he spoke. I don't think a complaint is the first thing I need tonight. Karen looked surprised. Mercer looked relieved. Daniel noticed both reactions. Then shook his head slightly. Don't misunderstand me. The relief immediately vanished from Mercer's face. Daniel continued. What happened here matters. His voice remained calm, but there was weight behind every word. If this had happened after 2 minutes, I probably wouldn't remember it next week. Nobody interrupted. But it didn't stop after 2 minutes. Mercer stared at the pavement. Daniel wasn't interested in humiliating him. Public embarrassment rarely changed people. It usually made them defensive. What interested him was whether anyone had learned something. He glanced toward the small group of hotel guests still watching. They saw it. Then he looked at Lawson. You saw it. Finally, his eyes returned to Mercer. And deep down, I think you saw it too. The officer said nothing. But his silence carried more honesty than any apology could have. Daniel picked up his suitcase. The shuttle delay, the rain, the questioning, suddenly it all felt exhausting. What happens next isn't really about me. Karen frowned. What do you mean? Daniel adjusted the handle of the suitcase. Tomorrow morning I'll still give my presentation. He paused. And I think everyone will get a much more useful version of it than the one I originally planned. A few people in the crowd exchanged glances. Even Lawson almost smiled. Because everyone understood what Daniel meant. The workshop no longer needed hypothetical examples. Real life had already provided one. As Karen escorted Daniel toward the waiting vehicle, Mercer remained beneath the awning. Watching. Thinking. For the first time that evening, he wasn't trying to figure out who Daniel was. He was trying to figure out how he had gotten him so wrong. 9 months later, the ballroom inside the Rivergate Convention Center was filled long before the program began. Uniformed officers sat alongside supervisors, city officials, emergency responders, and community leaders. Conversations echoed across the room as people settled into their seats. Near the front, Officer Lawson quietly reviewed the event agenda. A few rows behind him sat Officer Mercer. He hadn't spoken much since arriving. When Daniel Mensa walked onto the stage, the room welcomed him with polite applause. Nothing dramatic. Nothing ceremonial. Just professional respect. Daniel set a notebook on the podium and looked across the audience. For a brief moment, his eyes settled on Mercer. Neither man smiled. Neither looked away. Then Daniel began. I had a completely different presentation prepared for this conference. A few people laughed softly. Daniel smiled. But sometimes real life creates better teaching material than any PowerPoint slide ever could. The room grew quiet. Over the next hour, Daniel didn't lecture people. He told stories. He described how quickly misunderstandings can grow when assumptions replace curiosity. He spoke about communication, perception, stress, and the danger of believing we already know someone's story before hearing it. Nobody needed to be told what incident inspired the discussion. The lesson was already sitting in the room. When the session ended, people remained in their seats longer than expected. Some were taking notes. Others were simply thinking. As the audience slowly dispersed, Mercer approached the stage. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Mercer extended his hand. I should have listened sooner. Daniel looked at him. Then shook his hand. Most important lessons arrive late. Mercer nodded thoughtfully. This time, there was no argument. No assumptions. No uniforms creating distance. Just two people having an honest conversation. And sometimes, that was where real change started. What do you think was the turning point in this story? Was it the moment the officers saw the credential, or the moment they finally questioned their own assumptions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy original stories that explore justice, character, and real human decisions, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story.